these to get started. 2 folders, download them both, unzip them both. We're going to be working in both of them. I didn't pile it all into one because that would be too confusing. So the plan is with the CSS grid examples folder, it has essentially where we left off when I was introducing CSS grid last week. I'm going to review that. We're going to tweak it. I want to make sure it's all kind of nice and settled with you. Then we're going to start moving in the rest of the class into the couples resort, mobile build specifically, where we'll be adding a bunch of CSS. CSS we've seen. Obviously, I'll be introducing some new concepts with that as well. Hopefully, obviously, anyway. Just in the way that the grid is applied in different sort of CSS style properties, like background image and so on. And we'll kind of build it through and just keep an eye on making sure everything is understandable. At least as much as I can make it understandable. So grab those files and we shall begin. For your midterm, a couple of things. A couple of people have asked me, I mentioned this, but I will, maybe I'll send out an email, but I'll mention it to you again. I don't want a wireframe for your contact page. Okay? What I mentioned about that, all classes last week is there's not much to wireframe because the header and the footer should be the same. You're going to create your index page, you're going to make a copy of it to contact.html, then you're just going to replace the main content, or most of the main content, with just the contact number. So I don't need a wireframe for that. It's too simple and too straightforward. You've already wireframed up the index, and that's the hardest part. So if you've done that, then the wireframing is something that you've done. So I don't need that. Several people asked, since now we're kind of into CSS and they change your style, their midterm. I will remind you that that will be an assignment. That's going to be your last homework assignment. I'm not giving you the, well, it's homework 4. I'm not assigning that to you. I mentioned that last week as well. It seems to be a bit redundant. My cable or my adapter is being a little weird. So I've decided to scrap that one. So you will have to apply CSS and the CSS grid to your final. So some people are already applying CSS to the midterm, and that's great. I'm not going to grade CSS for the midterm because it's not a requirement. But if you are doing that, then you're getting a head start on when I will grade it, which is going to be for your final homework. Make sure in your layout that you're using CSS grid because that's one of the things that I would require. If you're styling it with like margins or some other way, it's got to be within the grid, and we just started that last week. So if you want to be able to apply it, that's great. But just make sure that you know that that's what I expect to see when I assign you the last week. Any other questions? Assignment related, otherwise related? Okay, so in the first folder, the CSS grid folder, the couples resort folder, I just want to point out, I do have this example. It's the one that we have from class. Now that you have it, my version of it anyway, for the floats. And we talked about being able to kind of use floats. We're going to use floats and some other stuff a little bit in the couples resort site here and there. And we'll talk about it more there. But that's just finished. We're not going to work on that. That's just, you have a copy of that. This is the index.html in that folder. And that's what you should see when you open it up. And that's where we'll start showing you how we applied this. Now we applied this, and I'm just going to review it for you, because again, review is good. Don't need positioning anymore, or styles. I'm just trying to save ourselves. So in index.html, that's what we have. I've started to, we got sort of part way of being able to style it out. I'll just review what we've done, and then I'll have you kind of style out and just kind of work out the rest of it. Again, give you a little bit of practice in terms of getting that working. See. Good. So nothing much in the HTML, you remember. I'm using divs just as an example. When we get into the couples resort, we'll be using divs, but also sections and things like that as well. Divs are primarily just for structural things, so sometimes we do use divs for grid stuff, because grid stuff isn't something that you want to explain to somebody through screen reader, or that something like the Google indexing bots care about. They don't care about that stuff at all. Guys need to be coming back a little bit more, not right outside the. Okay. So, we'll be using a combination. So what's going on here? So if I look here, and the style is main.css. So it's this one right here. Sure. Okay. So what we did is we have that container that you've seen a couple times now that centers, that gives a maximum width to your overall site. And because of the auto margins with 0, it automatically kind of centers your site. So we have that container, and that container is actually also our base grid. It's got some padding and some stuff inside of it, just generally speaking. We've seen kind of all these before. I could make that into a shortcut, and we've kind of seen that before, and we'll look at that shortcut because I think it's a few places in the couples resort build. The thing that was important is that we have to, in CSS, set its display property to grid. And after that, because that just says this is going to be a grid, it doesn't say what kind of grid it's going to be, how many columns it's going to be, how it's going to be laid out, what the width of anything is. So that's where we go to the grid template columns. There's also a grid template rows, but that's not something we're going to deal with in the examples for this term. And so the grid, display grid, grid template row, columns, column gap, and row gap. If you are using grid column gap or grid row gap, these are the newer ones. So I'm just going to switch to using those. They do the same thing as grid column gap and grid row gap, but grid column gap and grid row gap are newly deprecated. Let me talk about that for a little bit. Okay, if I put the grid back in, okay, and I look for this one. Somebody pointed it out in the last segment. I mentioned it, but I'm going to mention it again. I was using grid column gap. Stuff like this changes all the time. CSS undergoes kind of changes, new styles that kind of take out older styles, and it's important that I think that I take a minute so that you know what this is. Okay, so the grid column gap has got a line through it, along with some other ones that are there. You will see that from time to time in CSS, and what it refers to, well, when you see it here, it basically refers to something that is, the fancy word for it is deprecated. Deprecated means that it will still work for now. So if I use grid row gap, it's going to have the intended effect, but it's been replaced by something else. So deprecated means, yeah, okay, this is the way we used to do it. We now do it a different way. But they can't just switch over. If they just said this will no longer work, and what we had column gap will work, then millions of sites people would have to dive into it and start updating the stuff on the site. So they can't just stop it and go and start a new one. So it's a gradual transition. you'll find. And this is something not just for CSS, it's something that you'll find in code, JavaScript especially. There's a lot of deprecation that happens as newer ways of doing things kind of pop up. As they develop new ways of doing things and all the different JavaScript libraries and modules, it's really, really common in JavaScript, but it's part of every language that we use. So it's like you can use it for now, but expect at some time that it's probably going to be gone and it won't work anymore. So you have time to switch over to the new way. And how much time? There's no telling. Okay, there really isn't any way to tell how much time before you don't even see that option anymore within CSS. But it works for now, but I might as well kind of switch over. And all they really did for those grid row gap, grid column gap, and grid gap is they just replaced them without the grid word in it. So they just kind of shortened them a little bit. So I'm just using column gap and row gap now, because column gap and row gap are in fact not that big. Let me actually roll over this. I'll put the grid back, I'll roll over this. Properties obsolete, avoid using it. So it still works, but you should switch over, is essentially what it's done. So I've switched over. So in this example, I'm just using column gap and row gap. Okay. Remember for the columns, I showed you a couple things. You can specify columns of different widths just by saying, 200 pixels, 50 pixels, 200 pixels, and you can specify as much as you want. Generally, the strategy that we're using is to create equal width rows, or equal width columns, not equal width rows, but equal width columns. So rather than type out 80 pixels 12 times, there's the repeat function in there that says, for 12 times, make a column 80 pixels wide, 12 times. That's the way to be able to read it. So you can repeat anything, and you can make whatever and give it a solid width, and you'll get constant rows.
Does that determine how our elements are going to be positioned?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, it's the start of how our elements are going to be positioned. We're not going to use individual rows.
Right.
We're going to merge them together.
We're going to merge the columns?
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll merge them together to hold certain things.
Okay.
And we'll see that part down below. So again, that's just a function. Anytime you see a word followed by braces like that, it's a function. That's JavaScript, that's PHP, that's everywhere. Okay, so it's just a little unit that's built in that calculates and goes, okay, you want equal widths. If you add 12 times 80, and then you add the column gap 11 times, because if you look at, you have 12 rows, you have 11 gaps between, columns, I keep saying rows for some reason, but if you have 12 columns, you have 11 gaps between them. Each of them are 20 pixels long. So it's another 220. If you do 12 times 80 plus 220, you get 1180. That's why those numbers. Okay? So whatever your width is, you need to be able to divide it up into appropriately sized even columns, I would suggest to start with, like this, and take into account the column gap that you have as well, because that counts in the overall. And those should add up to your overall width, whatever that might be. Everybody good with that? Okay, now we come down to the second set of styles that we have here. And box 1, box 2, box 3, box 4 and box 5, I think those are the ones that I have. This is where we specify how many columns a particular element should span. So remember, we have 12 columns. Why are we using 12? Remember?
Easy to divide.
Yes, we can divide it in half, we can divide it in thirds, into quarters. It's a semi-magic number that way. It gives us a little bit more flexibility, so that's why 12 is often used. We don't use 12 on mobile layout, and you're going to see that in a second, and also when we move into couples resort, because that's, again, 12 really super skinny ones. You don't really need that. You can specify as many columns as you want within a particular grid. You can change them on the fly by defining new grids. Grids can be nested inside of grids. We're not going to go there, but that's possible to do. So it's very flexible that way. Remember the way that I'm doing it here, and it will change slightly when we move into the couples resort, but again, this is one way. It's good for you to be able to see different ways and different sort of keywords that CSS Grid has. This one actually says that row box 1, I want it to span from the grid lines 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now remember, when you have a grid, any type of grid, I won't draw out the 12, but I'll draw out the 4. Okay? When you have any type of grid, and this would be a 4-column grid, so we have 4 columns, and we can reference those columns, but we can also reference what are called the grid lines. And just remember that there will always be one more than the number of columns for fun. Okay? So if you're referencing it that way, I'm going to show you a different way to reference it when we move into couples resort. Just again, so you see different ways of being able to apply it. So this one though is registering the grid lines just by this syntax. When we have a number slash and another number, that is referencing the grid. So what this is going to do for the first container is it's going to start with 1, and then it's go 2, 3, 4, and there's 12, so it's going to take up 3 columns. So again, it's like a lava lamp. It's like all 3 of those thin columns merge together for that container. So what we get is the container for our logo. That's 3 of the 12 columns that we have. And it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, because we're looking at the lines. In this case, we're not looking at the specific columns themselves. At least not yet.
So it's counted by from the lines between?
Yes, and there's one at the very end,
Yep.
there's one at the very start, and there's one at the very end. In
So
this
the-
example, we're counting grid lines. Okay, so
then-
1, 2, 3, 4 means 3 columns.
So that would be 1/4 would be
Yep.
equal to 3.
Yes. 1/4 for 3. Now, taking these 3 things together, because they're all in a row in the final, I'm just mimicking the desktop version of the couples resort, just I have to have some sort of target. But if you look at the first 3, box 1, box 2, box 3, those 3 boxes, initially they started out just 1 column big. And we had 12. We had the ability to do 12, but we rarely want to use that. We might use it, well, there's one thing you're going to see that we do use it for, but it's a very specific kind of thing that we would ever use just 1 column. Normally, we want them to merge together. But remember, we have 12 ultimately to kind of work with, 12 columns to work with. So the columns that you're using should add up to 12. So we've got 1 to 4. So that would take it out to 4. I'm going to put a few more on here just so you can kind of see as we go through. Then I want to be able to go from 1 to 4. Then I want to be able to start at 4 and go all the way out to like 11, wherever that would be. There's some more columns. So I'm spanning out there. Okay, so that's 7. Yeah, 7 and 3. I have 2 left. So that would span 7 columns because again, it's 1 bigger. So it's 7 columns. So we have 3 columns, 7 columns, and then we have 2 columns. Remembering that for a 12-column grid, you're going to have the last one on the end here is going to be 13. But we don't put to 13. We didn't put 13. We put -1. Why did we put -1? Anybody remember? What's -1? What's that? Just go to the end is what it means. So that's a useful shortcut. Instead of going right to the end specifically, like 13, -1 just says go to the end of the row. Use up the rest of the columns that are available in this row. So that works if it's 4 columns. That works if it's 12 columns. That works for any number of columns. So that's why we didn't use the numbers specifically on that. We initially started by saying 11 to 13, just so you could see that it actually worked. But I substituted it for the -1, just because that's going to be the most functional way to be able to do it. This isn't the only way, as you're going to see, to to be able to kind of reference and use grid within CSS. So we're going to expand the concepts a little bit when we move into the other examples. So box 4 and box 5, we've got box 4 with grid column 1 to -1. So that's going to span the whole thing for grid column 4. And grid column 4 is box 4, so it's the hero banner. So it's a banner that stretches all the way across. So you can decide how many columns a particular element needs to take to be able to realize your design. So that's the hero banner from 1 to 13 if you like, but it's 1 to -1. So 1 to 4, 4 to 11, 11 -1 gives us that row. Then 1 to 1/-1 gives us that row. I don't remember if I mentioned this before with welcome text. I don't know if we did this part. I know I did it with the other group, so I'm going to kind of go through that anyway. You'll notice how it starts not at the end or not at the beginning, and it doesn't end. It's sort of centered, but there's space on either side. Now these ones here, because there's space on this side, we haven't styled 6 yet, so don't worry about that, because until we finish putting styles in for all of them, and grid column references in for all of them, I don't want 6 on here. I want 6 to be on another line, but we'll kind of force that as we go through. So what I want is the welcome text. Now, if you'll remember from Couples Resort, the welcome text is indented a little bit on both sides. So we could create the container 1 to -1 and then just put in like padding on the left and on the right to achieve the same effect. But you don't really need to have to use all the columns in a particular row. So if I look at welcome text, see if this makes sense. So the welcome text is box 5, and in box 5, I have grid column not starting at 1, I started from 3, and it goes all the way to 11. So it doesn't start at the beginning, it doesn't start at the end. Remembering that when we're using line references, it's 1 to 13. So I'm skipping 2 here and 2 at the end. And that makes it just fit within a smaller amount. That's like indenting it on both sides. I could have set it to 12 and then have the padding kind of do that, but I want you to understand that with the grid, you don't have to use up all 12 columns every single row. You can just say, okay, that's where I want that to be. So I might as well fix it into the grid so that then I don't have to worry about big, huge bunches of padding. I can just pad it so it reads nicely and use the padding for just creating some readable space and some breathing space. And I'm not using, there's nothing in the area to the left and to the right of it. Does that make sense? Ignoring this, ignoring the stuff here, ignoring this at all, because we haven't got to 6 yet. So it's centered and it's in there, and that's where if you just think about that, we have a big banner. We have the logo, the menu, and the book now. We have a big, tall banner with a background image in it, which we're going to see today. And then we have the welcome to the Couples Resort right underneath that. So you don't have to use them all, but that creates what seems to be a problem with 6. What do I mean by that? Because I'm not using the last 2 columns. The first 2 columns, it's not a problem. There's space there. But because I'm not using the last 2 columns, the other ones sneak up into that space. They're like nudging up into that space, which I absolutely don't want. I want 6 to start down on another row. The welcome text is the only thing that I want on that particular row, and I want that to be space on the other end. I don't want a bunch of other content in there. Any ideas what I can do with 6? So, if I'm going to come here, and let's create another one. Box 6. What do you think I can do grid line-wise to make that stop happening? Because this one doesn't finish. All the other ones, this one, they finished. The first 3, they took up 12. The 4th one takes up 12. This one only takes up 8. So there's space at the end, so these other things are just trying to sneak up into it. What can I do to make sure box 6 doesn't do that? Any ideas? What's that? There is span for this. That wouldn't quite fit this problem. Let's stick with, we can do it with, I'm going to introduce span in the other example. Just that's another way to be able to identify a number of columns. And so we're going to look at a different arrangement of it. But for right now, just with the line reference, with the grid line references. What's that? 1/2 for 6. Well, it would start at 100%. And then let's do /3 just for right now, okay? Until I really look at it. So what I'm doing here is, even though this isn't done, if I start the next one, box 6, at 1, that forces it to go down to another row because it's got to start at 1. And in this row, 1's already taken up, so it's not going to jump over to 1. So if I do that, oops, sorry, I forgot. Remember, I have to do that. I'll put that in a minute. We'll look at that in a minute. Then I have to go here and make sure that box 6 has both styles. The basic box style that makes it gray and white and curved. And then this is my grid style. So make sure that it's box 6 spacing. Remember, you can add multiple classes to a particular element. And that's going to become more and more important as we kind of move on. So if I say that now, go up here, that should force 6 down, which it does. So now, again, because I didn't finish it, I didn't go all the way up to the end, the grid kind of said, oh, there's still room. Okay, but I don't want there to be anything there. But if I just start the next one after 5, if I start the next one at 1, then that will just take up, that will force it down because it's got to come over here to start. And it won't go in front, so it's got to create another row. And to, again, remember what we're creating here are just containers. This can be applied to sections or articles, as well as divs, as well as nav, any semantic tags, any div tags. These are just containers that take content. If I had a logo, if I had the menu, if I had the Book Now button, I could just start putting that content into those boxes. Take the black box off, make it invisible. Boxes by default are invisible, so I'd probably take the background color off, style it however I want in terms of the font, and then just start putting content in it. Because these are content containers that we're applying the grid to. Yeah. That make sense? Oh, sorry.
No. Could you repeat what you were saying about in the index.html about the box class? You were saying something we have to specify.
Okay, if you look at the styles, you'll see that we have a style, a class style called box,
Yeah.
which is just a look and feel style. It's just background colors dark gray, text colors white. It's got border radius to curve off the corners, and it's got padding, and it aligns the text into it. So that's got nothing to do with layout. That just makes the box look like a black box, essentially. So that's why this is called a black box layout.
Okay.
Okay. I could put the grid stuff in here, but every box needs a different grid reference. So I can't kind of combine them very easily without repeating a lot of content. So I'm separating them out so that the look and feel, the design of those simple boxes is in one class. And then the grid layout specifics are in a different class. And then we just apply the different class by saying class equals this class space, this other class space, this other class. You can apply 4, 5, 6 if you want to. You can apply as many as you want, different classes to a particular element. That's why, again, classes are the most useful and the most flexible option, generally for CSS. Although we use all of them. We use classes because of their flexibility.
Thank you.
No problem. Does that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Okay. Then I'm going to let you work with this for a little bit. before we move on. I'm going to show you the layout finished with all 10 of those. Looks like that. So, create that for the other box. Change it around, add to it. Again, the best way to kind of be able to let this set in your jelly brains is to just be able to kind of work on it. This is roughly more or less. This is split, but you can do that. You should be able to kind of see that I've got it taking up 12, but I've changed it, and then 6 is up here. This is for a menu, so again, it doesn't finish all the way. So come up with the grid line references that will give you a layout like that. This is, again, a very rough layout for the index page, the desktop version of the index page for couples users.
So which folders are we working on? The couples resort one?
You're working on your, what I gave you.
Oh,
Okay?
the mobile grid HTML?
No, not the mobile.
Oh,
is
this
main.
one.
We've only got up to 6. You've got 7, 8, 9, and 10 to add.
Okay.
Okay, so I want you to finish what we did in class. We have it right now. Looks like. This is what you should have right now, something like this. Okay, what I want you to do is finish it so that the layout looks like that.
Okay.
It's just counting the lines,
Did you-
figuring out where you want things to be placed.
Did you take away the container color?
What's that?
The container color?
What about the container color?
Because up here, I don't know if it's just because of the display, but it looks like there's not a light gray box.
Yeah, that's the background color of that particular thing. If you
Okay.
look in the box class, it's just got a background color.
Okay.
Okay? I don't want you to do anything with that. Just what you're doing here is setting the number of columns that each element should take up.
Okay, sounds good, thank you.
And this is what you would do if you have your wireframe. So finally your wireframe can come into play, because for your midterm, if you don't use CSS, then it's all normal flow just stacking on top of one another. But now you're using the grid, you can look at your wireframe and go, these, I need 3 containers on the top, I need this, I need this. You would add divs where necessary to kind of space it out. But again, this is how you will apply CSS to actually get the layout. You're not ever working in the dark here, specifically. You have something that you're trying to maintain. Let me see if I can just open it up. Okay, so I'm working on something here that we can add. So like for this example, I've got it split in half. This takes up 1/2, this takes up the other half. So it's 6 columns and 6 columns. This doesn't go all the way to the end because it's like a submenu. It doesn't start at the beginning and it doesn't go all the way to the end. So in my example, so I'm just using this as a rough way to be able to kind of say, okay, this will give us the containers positioned so that I can put the main menu here, I can put that sub menu here. This welcome text you can leave all 12, because if I look at it, it's 12. I think I did that with the other group, just so this one doesn't actually have to be across. I'll change that. That's fine. Again, if the grid line references and the grid stuff that we've done so far is making sense, you should be able to get this or any grid layout. Remember, you're not working in the dark. It's like, what grid layout am I shooting for? Well, look at your wireframe. That's why you have the wireframe and the XD files to begin with. Is to be able to, Jared's given you the XD files for Couples Resort with the columns all kind of laid out. So then you start to go, okay, this takes up 3 columns. So that'd be 1 to 4. This takes up 7 columns. Then that would be right next to it. So that's 4 to whatever, to whatever. So you just make that translation from what you have in your XD file to containers that are like this. They're only black or dark gray because this, again, do it as a just generic sort of layout. Then you can take that black box away. It's just the background color. Just take it away, take all the borders away, do whatever you want. And then the page would be completely empty, but all of your containers are in the right place. If you can't figure out this, or you don't know what you're doing with this, please let me know. Okay, because we're going to move into sort of more applications of this. I don't want the issues to kind of start here. I'm hoping that this makes sense to you. But take a few and work with it. Try to get that layout, try some different layouts, tweak it, because that's what you'll have to do for your midterm. Xavier.
Why is the welcome text next to the 6?
Sorry?
Why is the welcome text next to the 6?
I think I did that with the other class. If you want to make it the whole width, that's fine, because that's how it actually should be. I think I broke that up with the other class and I just didn't change it. So, but you can change it. Okay, again, if the grid line reference and the ideas of the grid are making sense to you right now, you should be able to change it so it's half and half. Instead of going 1 to -1 for the welcome text, you would change the end point and the start point to be able to kind of make that work. So again, it's indented text, could be 2 columns, could be 1 column. Again, this gives you ultimate flexibility in how to come up with your base grid.
I'm having trouble visualizing the grid layout, like how, like where to position it, like for example, the welcome text.
Okay, so for the welcome text, you're going to put a grid column, so you're just going to create a class for that box, right?
Mm-hmm.
And in that box, it'll have one thing, just grid column, and then you'll have number/number.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, will it start at 1?
No.
No. Will it start at 2? Probably not. Try starting it at 3.
Oh, so it's just like visually?
Yeah.
Like there's not actually like it's not grid like.
It's not what, sorry?
Like the way I'm just trying to like visualize it with like columns with the spaces like
Yeah.
how we do on XD, but I can't.
Well, the spacing is taking care of
Approximate.
itself. You're not creating the spacing because the spacing is created by the column gap.
No, I know. I'm just trying to. It's hard for me to visualize which column or column I'm supposed to start at, like how to approximate.
Well, it didn't seem so because it doesn't start at 1, right?
No.
It doesn't start at 2, so it probably starts at
3.
try 3, and then figure out, okay, where does it end? And then the number for that. Probably 7. So again, you might not get it right the first time. It might be too long or not indented enough, so go back and tweak it a little bit. Yeah.
What if I want to create, for example, between 7 and 8, I want to get a bigger row gap.
Oh, well, you could do that kind of specifically. That's a good question. You could do that kind of specifically with specific margins as well. Remember, the row gap and the column gap are consistent when you do it this way. But we still have access to like margin. So if I wanted a gap, I could say like more of a gap after 8 or more of a gap after 7. What do you want? After 7, you want more of a gap. Then on 7, I would set the margin bottom to be a high number. And that would push everything else. The height is not being controlled by the height of these elements. It will still be controlled by the amount of content inside. Unless we give them a specific height, which in some cases we're going to, they won't have any given height to them. That's just kind of a default. Okay? But as soon as we start putting the logo in, that's going to make the logo one taller. So once you get all of your content in, then you can kind of adjust it using margin top, margin bottom, whatever it is that you want to do. Because the grid's not controlling that at all. You have to be careful about margins if you're using grid and adding margins at the same time, because you might go over your total width if you do that. But remember, you can do margin bottom specifically to create more space underneath. And that will just kind of push things down. You can try it if you like. But, so for one style, it might have a margin bottom on it to push everything else down. Like that. But again, you're just visualizing and counting. You're just basically saying, okay, so the first two columns are nothing. If this was the layout, the last two columns are nothing. I'm going to say, it's not 3 because the logo's 3, so it has to be 2. So I'm missing 2, so I have 8 left. And those two are split to 4 and 4 to be able to get that. Yeah.
Can IDs also have more than one name, just like classes?
Sorry?
Can IDs also have more than one name?
IDs, you can only use an ID once. Okay? Classes, you can reuse ID, you can only have ID on an HTML page once. So again, this doesn't start at 1, looks like it starts at 2, and looks like it goes all the way over to here. Now that's a little bit deliberately, it's not centered like the other ones are, because if you look at that menu in the couples resort, it's kind of offset to the left a little bit. So that's where that sub-menu would go, why choose couples resort. So if you can get this arrangement, you should be able to get any arrangement using that. Other questions? Happy to clarify anything that's not making sense. So again, it's kind of all the same from 6, from box 5, box 6. Like, they don't look different. It's just being able to kind of figure out, okay, what are the references that are going to make it this wide? And you can take any, sorry, let me, yeah.
When I add an image, like there is your vendor container,
Right?
with the image, of course, because it's too stretched, will the image fit that container or will it get bigger?
Well, I hope that the image should fit the container that you're putting in. I don't know who's speaking to you on this. It used to be part of 1050, but I'm not really sure. But your web images should be the size that they take. They shouldn't be bigger.
But the container is like, it's just very small right now.
Yeah, but
so-
remember, the grid doesn't do anything with heights.
Oh,
Okay? The only reason that it's that high at all is because of what we've got set in box. Otherwise, it would be no height. You wouldn't see anything. If it didn't have any content in it, you don't see it. So the content is making it a little bit big. So you, divs, sections, whatever, in terms of how tall they are, that has to do with the content. If I threw an image in there, then it would force the thing down to hold the entire image. Okay? But when it comes to width, you should create your images with the widths that fit into your layout. And you should know exactly what they are. So if this is going all the way out to the thing with spacing on the side and so on, I want this to be somewhat less. If it was an image going here to take up the whole thing, I would want to make sure that my image was the size Also keeping in mind the padding and so on that we have on the general site. There's a little bit of that, so keeping that in mind. So not, that doesn't mean that this would be 1180, this would be different. Okay, if you look. Okay, the container has its own styles applied to it. So forget about the grid stuff, because the grid stuff is, you know, that's fine. But we also have a total width of 1180, but we have padding inside it. 20 from the top and the bottom and 10 left and right. So it's never gonna create, so you would want 20, if I was creating a banner to go to full size, let me ask you this, okay? It has a padding left and a padding right of 10 pixels inside the main container. So if I wanted the image to stretch the full thing, how wide should that image be? In pixels. You should be able to tell from here. Sorry?
The same as the width there?
No.
1000? Oh,
That's the total width. But we have 10 pixels of padding on both ends. So if you made it the full width, it's too big.
1, 2.
Sorry?
How much one?
I can't, sorry, still can't hear it.
The full width is 1,200.
No, the full width is 1100 meters. So it's right there. 1160. Does everybody see 1160?
Oh,
You have to take 20 away because there's padding on each side.
Oh, I see.
So that becomes part of the arithmetic you have to do. Okay, so that would be the width of that particular one. Yeah.
If we were to increase the bottom margin, say on box 8,
Yeah.
and then is it saved to like 60 pixels? Is it 60 pixels plus the styling that we did for the main container with the padding between elements?
Well, the padding is inside of the elements. We don't have anything between, you'll notice. I haven't had any margins to any of this, because margins, I'm letting the grid take care of that. The grid row gap and the grid column gap, in this example, these replace our margins. If we want them bigger, we can add bigger margins to say box 8, to that style for box 8, if we want to push it down. That's what you had asked before.
So if I wanted to make it 60, would I do 20 plus 40 pixels, like to make it 60 in total, or would it be 60?
No, remember, they're two different things. Well, you have to take that into account. You do have to take it into account. But, so whatever your margin, yes, you would take that into account, that there's 40 pixels of extra space around the content when you're looking vertically. There's 40 pixels. So if you want to specify some things a little bit more, but that would be more just trial and error.
Okay.
Okay, it wouldn't be like I did before. So I just did that. Let's say I want some space after 7. I want 8, 9, and 10 to have more of a gap. So if I come into here and I go to box, oops, that's not finished one, to this one, and be able to go to box 7. Okay, the grid row and column gaps are taking care of the separation between elements without using margins. So I'm never going to add a margin in the grid reference here, but I can add a margin, and I can add a margin specifically on the bottom of 60 pixels. Now again, there is 20 pixels of padding at the bottom, so you won't know until you get your content in whether that's going to be enough. Once the content is in, you can go, yeah, that's enough, that's a little bit more. But that's a specific thing that you're doing. You wouldn't change it in the grid gap areas, because that would change all of them. So we're starting with the basic column gap and row gap. If you want to increase it for some reason, then you specifically would do that with margin gap.
So then would total space between the elements be equal to the row gap plus the margin bottom?
Yep.
Okay.
100%.
Got it. And row gap applies, so it's like 40 in between each element, not 40 here and 40 here, right?
Yeah, you're right.
Okay.
It doesn't double up.
Okay.
Okay, so if I'm looking up here and I've got the padding, or I've got the row gap is 50 actually. But so it's 50 pixels, but it's 25. It's like not 50 plus 50. Margins will add up. A margin top will add to a margin bottom and you'll get 100 pixels. But with this is easier to figure out because you just give it one value and it just creates that much space between the elements.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions, other issues? I'll make sure this is clear as we move.
So if we have to add the margin, we add in the container.
In the container, yeah, that's specifically what I did for that. Just because I want the next row to be down a little more. I could probably go minus, never tried this, but I could probably go minus 22 for box 7 to override the rows. Yeah, so if you use a minus value for margins, I can bring them a little closer. I would say probably set a minimum value for the row gap. Don't set it to be huge because then everything kind of looks really weird and spaced out. Set a minimum value or no value. You don't have to have any gaps between the rows or the columns. It's totally completely, all of these settings are totally completely up to you. Does this make sense? Everybody's doing all right with it? I gave you another example. That's the mobile grid HTML and mobile.css, which looks like that. Same general idea, a black box layout, but in this case for more of a mobile layout. So a couple things I'll point out here. I said that in most cases, if you created like however many equal width columns, generally you merge them together to hold the contents. Sometimes you might use a single column, but it's rare. This is an example. Why would I do this? Why is this only one column for a menu? It will open up, but what will you see there, typically? What's that? Sorry.
Would you see a list? Menu items?
Well, you can see a list. Sometimes you don't, though. How do you access a menu on your phone on a lot of websites?
Yeah, hamburger.
There's a hamburger icon there. There's 3 lines. They call that a hamburger icon. That's where you know the menu is, right? You've all seen that probably a million times. Okay? So that makes sense because that's a tiny little graphic, an SVG graphic that's going to be there that we can animate and stuff. That will actually control the display of the menu. We don't want the menu to display in a big list. Generally, it takes up a lot of space. You're going to see that when we start moving into the couples resort one. It just takes up a lot of space at the top. Sometimes it's there. We don't want a horizontal menu because in order to fit in here, because we have a lot less real estate, a lot less width to work with, putting in we'd have to like put them really close together, make the font smaller, and that's not usable on a phone. So instead, we have an icon. You touch the icon, then that menu will actually appear. We're actually going to do that for couples resorts. So it's exactly how that's done. Okay, so that's why one column is probably okay. For the Book Now button, I've still got it over there, but I'm kind of shifting it as we go through. Okay, and then you'll notice that the majority of the containers now, instead of being broken up onto, we've gotten rid of our rows, like our desktop rows. That only makes sense when you have a window as big as you can get on the desktop. Okay? When you have a window that's phone size, this isn't exact phone size, but just enough so you get the idea. Then what you're laying out, and again, this is from your XD file. Okay? You've done the desktop version of the site. You figure out the black box for that. Then for the mobile version of your site, you figure out what the grid settings are for the mobile version. Okay, you have both of them in XD. You have high, what was Jared called, high resolution wireframe of both of them. So you have to figure out how many rows do I need, and what is most of it going to look like. Well, if you think about your experience with mobile sites, this is normally what we see for content. We don't see rows with little tiny pieces in them, because those pieces would have to be so small, it makes them hard to interact with. So it switches from the full-on, full row kind of 12 column to something that is a lot more compact. And they just stack on top of one another generally. This isn't complete and so on, but I just want you to be able to see that's what we can do. Another thing that we can do, there was one other thing in here that I wanted to kind of point out to you, at least I hope it's here. I'm going to go into mobile.css. In this particular one, we have, so in mobile grid HTML, again, we just have it's containers inside of there. Box 8 is secondary navigation. You can see that there. But when I look here, there isn't any secondary navigation at all. And that's because I've set that one to have a grid reference, but I've also said it's displayed to none. So it just goes away. So we know, you've seen, you can use display none to be able to just remove something entirely from the flow of the document. Why would you want to do that in terms of mobile? Any ideas? Just from being consumers of mobile sites. How do you feel when you've got video on mobile sites that play? How do you feel when you're on a bus and you hit a site and it has this video that starts to play in the stream? Don't you go, this is taking up a lot of data. I don't want it to be able to take up a lot of data. That's what I think. When I'm on cell and I'm not on Wi-Fi, it's kind of like, I maybe don't want to see a video. I certainly don't want to see a video this big, maybe. But I also maybe don't want to see it at all on the mobile version of the site, because then you're streaming and downloading it. You would assume that people using the mobile site, some of them, if not most of them, aren't on Wi-Fi. They're using their cell service. Videos are large data items. They have to stream down and use up your data to be able to do that. So I could, if that was for a video on the main site, then I can reformat it so it actually doesn't display at all, and I can just take it out of the mobile site. So, okay, it's every other thing in there except the video, because I'm trying to be respectful of people's data plans and bandwidths and things like that and so on. Okay, that's used all the time. There's some content in the, there will likely often be, for you guys, some content on a main desktop site that you don't need or want on the mobile site. Either it's not going to be functional or you're going to replace it with something else. So I can make these disappear if I want to, and just focus on the content that's going to download quickly, that gives people the basic information, and keep all the icing and sprinkles on the top for the desktop site, like high bandwidth kind of video.
In the container, the grid template columns, you have repeat for 1FR. What does that
I
mean?
do. I'm about to get to that. That's a good question. Look at the way that I've defined the grid in this one. It's almost the same. I'm using much less in terms of a row and a column gap. Like I say, that could be 0. I want everything to kind of be compact and kind of fit together. Again, that's up to you. When you build it and look at it at the phone size, is it too much gap? Is it pushing something down? You just have to figure out what that gap should be to accommodate your content. Maybe you don't want any gap at all. Okay? At least maybe for columns, you want them to be able to go. Right now we have like 10 between the columns. Maybe that's not something that we need. Okay? Typically, that's the case. That especially on mobile, that will make the column gap 0 just so all the content can fit together. And you can get more content without those spaces inside of it. Now remember, it's a different idea. We're not going for multiple containers in a row. Generally, we're going for one container per row. And it's going to be much more of a stacking thing because that's how you use a mobile site. You go vertical. You don't want to go horizontal. Okay? So it's almost the same, except for this part. So I made a slight tweak. I mentioned this last time, though. that you can use pixels like we did, and that will give you a fixed width column. What that stands for, FR, any idea?
Right?
That's a good guess, but it's not. Frame, well, it could be, it could be thought of as a frame. The way I think about it is it's short for fraction. Okay, so I'm saying, repeat 4, 1 fraction for 4, so that's gonna break up the screen into 4 columns and fill the screen. So I'm not giving it a specific width. I'm saying that if, take up all the space, only 4 columns, again, I wouldn't use 12 columns here, because using the 12 columns and trying to approach it like you're approaching a desktop site, that's not what you want to be able to do. So I've gone down to 4 columns, because I can go all the way across, I can split into 2, or I can use individual ones. And for a mobile layout, at least for this mobile layout, that's generally all I need. Okay? But instead of saying, okay, what's the total width and breaking it down, you can also give it what I mentioned last time is a more responsive, a more fluid kind of unit that we're using. So that's basically like fractions. So it'll break it up into 25, 25, 25, 25 to make 100% of the width. If the phone's a little bit bigger, it'll come out and be a little bit bigger because those 25s are slightly wider. If it's a wider phone or a smaller phone, it will always be breaking it up to take up the full width of the screen and to give you 4 columns that take up the full width of the screen. But unlike the ones that we specify in pixels, those widths will never change. Okay, they're 80 pixels and that's what they are. But you can specify it to be a little bit more flexible. It's a more dynamic kind of unit to use with CSS Grid. So just think about it as fractions. So I'm just dividing each column into 25% of the available space. Let me, actually, let me show you. I think I can show you fairly easily. Haven't thought about this. So that's the original width. So I've got 4 columns that kind of take that up. Right. Save it. Work as I want it to. Should have seen it spread out a little. Not spread. Possibly because. Figure it out. Should be a little more flexible. See if I can find out the issue with it because I'm sure I'm not. So again, for right now, if you were to build out a site, you're building out all your pages statically. We don't know how to make things responsive yet. Okay? And what responsive means is that you want to cite one site with one CSS file to be able to go from this to this. It's the same content. You're going to assume it's the same content unless you've decided to like display none something and you don't want all the content on the mobile. But you want it so that as the window changes, it will morph from this as the available width gets narrower and narrower, and will actually get to here. That's what responsive means, is that everything on the desktop size will kind of scrunch down, or on the mobile, if you bring it out, it will expand out dynamically. And dynamic things like fractions and so on, being able to kind of divide it up will make that easy. You're not going to do that until next term, but that's what we want to be able to do. So right now, you'd have to create mobile index and desktop index. But after term 2 web class, you just have to create index, and then with things in CSS that you haven't seen yet, we're able to say if the width of the window is desktop width, use this grid CSS. But if it has a minimum width of a certain amount, I want you to switch dynamically to that and be able to use that. Then we're only creating one site with one page, with one CSS file, and it will actually be able to do both of those things. That's the ultimate goal that you'll get to through term 2. Right now, don't know how to do that. Being able to switch out the grid. Essentially, it's just kind of like CSS can figure out how wide the screen is that somebody is looking at your content on. So if you have a site that's out there in the web, and somebody comes to it on their desktop, they can look at the width of the browser window. And if it is a width that suggests it's a desktop situation, then it will use the desktop CSS. But if somebody else, somewhere else, goes on their phone and hits the same website, so imagine I'm here on my desktop looking at your desktop site. If somebody else is on a phone somewhere else, and they go to your same site, it will go, okay, this is only like 300 and whatever wide. So this is not a desktop, this is mobile, so that's what I'm going to be able to use. So those two people are consuming the same site, the same files, same CSS, but they're seeing it at a layout that's appropriate for their screen. That's where we're heading. And that is generally what CSS media queries do. If the width is this, do this. Otherwise, if the width is this, do something else. Don't worry too much about that because, again, you don't have to do that. All right. So you have an example of, I just gave that to you. We're not going to build out anything with it. I just gave it to you for reference. So I'm going to, assuming there's no questions, I'm going to shut these down to give myself some space. Because we're moving on to, oh, right, this is good. Okay, so we're going to pull all this in practice now with some real honest to goodness content. We're going to start and continue over the next while, however long it takes, to build out step by step all of the elements that you need for the mobile version. So we're doing the mobile one first because mobile first is the strategy that we want to be able to use. Again, mobile is like the majority of people now, if you look at the stats, access web through their phones. In the Western world anyway, but also in Europe and everywhere else. So we're not going to design both. Your final integrated project is for the mobile stuff only. So we are going to build out the entire index page together in class. Then you're going to build out, what is it, 2 other pages? I can't remember that you have to build out, but you will have the base, and then you will just build out the pages. They will be separate HTML pages with some different content and some different things inside of them, but we're going to build out the structure for this. So that it looks like I took out the hamburger menu and that sort of stuff. We are going to do that, but we're going to do that last because it's the thing that I think is the most complex, is being able to have a toggling menu. This is the reason why we don't want the menu to just always be visible. Okay, number one, trying to make this a usable horizontal menu likely isn't going to be very successful. By the time I put these all in one line and stretch them out over 4 columns, I'd have to make them so small and so close together that it's not a very useful sort of thing. So typically mobile menus will still be vertical like this, which is great because lists are already vertical. We have to make them horizontal. But for a mobile menu, I want this, but I don't want to see it. Just, it doesn't make sense that all the space is taken up. With this, even when it's styled, I don't want that up there. I'd like it to start at the couples resort with that up there, or the couples resort to start up here and just have a little hamburger menu. When we click it, this will appear, and then when we toggle it, it'll just go away. So I think, again, that's the thing we've used a number of times. I've taken that out of both examples, mine and the one you're working with, because again, we're going to build out the other things in here before we come back and finally do that. So that's going to be an eyesore for a little bit. Then we have the Book Now button. We have the header with the span in here that we'll talk about. This is yours, so it's pretty broken at this point. And we're going to start to transform it. Other than that, imagine the hamburger menu there for a minute, and this is kind of moved up. This is sort of the fully fleshed out page. So there's more CSS that we need to be able to look at, which will also include animations, which I know you're looking at in your authoring class as well, CSS animations, or you should be. Maybe you're not at this point, but you will, if you haven't already. We're going to employ some of them in here for some of our rollover effects and for the menu toggle and things like that. We'll employ some of that in. You'll notice there is one in here. If I roll over the send button for the form, it changes black, but it also kind of, see how it's curved corners? It changes to a square one. Not that that's an ideal effect, but it's just, but it doesn't happen all at once. So it happens over like a certain amount of time. It's a gradual sort of thing. The same thing will happen with the hamburger menu as we come through. Same thing happens here. Okay, we do have a rollover. We've seen how we can do a rollover with a pseudo class, like with the hover pseudo class. We have an example of that that we did. This is using that, but there's also a little bit of an animation inside. Okay, so we'll come back and throw in some of those animations where they are appropriate. All right, so that's going to be our focus for a while. So I'm looking at, I'm going to close mobile grid, mobile CSS, and I'm just looking at index.html, and, sorry, different one. I'm actually going to go over there from this. Different folder. So index.html, that connects to two CSS files, grid CSS, main.css. I have some more files than you have, but that's two. I want to be able to focus on the index.html for this. So we're in the other folder, in case you haven't figured that out. The one called Couples Resort, week 10. Couples Resort Mobile, week 10, probably is what it says. And I'm just going to go through and kind of show you all the features and demonstrate what it is that you need to know. Starting here actually with in the head part. Before we even get to the grid and stuff like that, I'm going to start with the head part here. Okay. We are linking to two different local CSS files. We've separated them out. We've separated out grid and some basic styling into its own CSS file. And then we have all of the look and feel stuff and so on in, or most of it, in the other file as well. So you can separate them out. You can have multiple CSS files. You can separate out your CSS to where it makes sense. Sometimes structural CSS is in one. Sometimes all that zeroing stuff, where it sets the margins to 0 and the padding to 0 and the border to 0 and so on, that might be called like a reset.css, and you can link to that because that's a reusable file. That's something you want to do all the time. So if you put that into a separate file and link to it with a link tag, then it will always be available for you. So that's much more what a team of people would do. Everybody's using that same file for multiple projects. So reset.css might be one of the ones. It doesn't matter that all the CSS is in one. Okay? It does matter that there are CSS files and it's not mixed up with the HTML. But if you split them up further, like we've done here, in some instances that makes sense. Okay? So we're going to talk about that and build those out. But I actually want to talk about this stuff first, because this will be important to you as well. Now this might look very scary, but it's not scary. The reason it's not scary is you can use this in your site exactly as it is. All you have to do is change the name of a couple of things. But this example that you have right now, and you've had this before actually, I think, but this is the example that you have right now. Those links are basically ready to go. All you have to do is just change what they're actually pointing to. And so just edit the names of stuff a little bit. And I'm going to show you exactly what that is, or how that's done. So the first three, actually, are links to external resources. And they actually set the font that you want to be able to use. Okay? In this example, we're not using the default font. We're using a font called Sanchez. Sanchez is a font from the Google Fonts repository, which I'm going to show you in a second. They're all free fonts. There are hundreds of free fonts that you can use for any project that you want, commercial or otherwise. Okay? So, one of the things that you want to be able to do if you've identified, maybe Jared's already talked to you about this, but for the fonts you're going to be using, well, for your FIP, you're going to use the same fonts. So this is ready to go for for building out the other couples resort pages, because we don't really want the base font to change. Okay? But I'm going to show you how that is kind of rendered. The first two things, download just some CSS function libraries that the Google Fonts need. The third one actually downloads the particular family that I want. If I want more than one font, I would need more than one of those last links. The first two links I only do once, but if I'm bringing down multiple fonts, I would do that third link for every font family that I want to bring down. So you should be able to find, if you can't find a font that suits your needs or what you're thinking about in the free Google fonts, you're probably thinking much too specifically about fonts, or you're doing something where you're, they don't have things like the horror fonts and stuff. So if your client is like, cannibal devil worshiper, might not suit your needs. Okay? But at the same time, there's lots of stuff out there. To be able to find it, I've already got it right here in Browser. A couple of things. So you go to fonts. .google.com. Let me go right back there because now I'm in developers. So I'm going to go fonts.google.com. I'll post this. Okay? And it takes you right into the Google fonts that are there. So now you can search for fonts that they have. Okay? You can look at them specifically. You can preview the text and so on. You can set different weights of the font, italic or whatever it is that you want to be able to use. I'm just going to go to the FAQ here for a sec. Is there a cost to any of these fonts? No. Okay. Can I use any font in a commercial project? Yeah. Can I use a font in a logo? Yeah. So it's completely free for you to use. It's not copyrighted or anything else. So your first job is to find a font that you want to be able to work with. It went to the developers.google.com fonts. But the thing is to be able to kind of search in here and be able to kind of see, okay, where's the fonts that I actually go back here. Not letting me go back. Try that. Okay, so this is where you kind of land onto it. And then what you want to be able to do is say, okay, how do I do this thing? How do I put it on? If I found a font, all you really need to know is the family that you want to have the font. What is the name of it? If I go to what's called the Developer API, which sounds very scary, okay? It basically just gives you an idea of how do I get the fonts in there. And you already have a working example. So what it's actually saying here is, okay, so for web and application developers, which includes you now, okay? But at this point in time, essentially what you're doing is you're creating this one here. Well, you don't need an API key for the free fonts. No, I don't want that. I want here. That's not my page, this website. Fonts. Go back to the repository. How can I use Google Fonts on my website? use the Google Fonts CSS API rather than the JavaScript one. So if you go to fonts.google.com, it will take you to where you can search for the fonts. Then if you click on the FAQ, it will give you a link. How do I use Google Fonts on my website? Okay, fonts that support your language. Don't worry about the symbol stuff and so on. I'm going to talk about that through a different method, although that's possible. But I want the Google Fonts CSS API. So essentially, oh, there we go. They've combined it now. That's good to know. All right, let me see if I can make this a little bit bigger. So what you'll see is it all starts with a new base URL, fonts.googleapis.com/CSS2. And if you look, that's exactly what we have. These ones are font libraries that you should have. Just keep these tags in the page. That's all you need to do. So I'm not really going to talk about those at all. They're beyond our pay grade at this point. But I do have fonts at googleapis.com/CSS2. Then there's a question mark, and then I start saying family equals Sanchez and display equals swap. But that's just so we can swap out. We can swap out that style with other things, but that's just the standard one we have there. So that's exactly what we're talking about. You already have one set up for Sanchez. Okay. So font googleapis.com, CSS2, family equals whatever. That plus is only if the font has a space in its name, because you can't have in a URL, you can't have a space, remember? So the plus is how they evolve that. I don't need it for Sanchez because it's one word, but Crimson Space Pro, I would. So they put a plus in there. And then you can bring it right into a font family declaration for your body. As long as you've loaded it in the top, in the head part, that's what's going on here. As long as you've loaded it in the head part, okay, then you can start referencing it in the style. Multiple families. You don't actually have to put separate ones in anymore. You can go Crimson Pro, ampersand, or and, family equals literata, and family equals whatever. If you're at 3 fonts, you're probably 1 font too many. But you can do to both of your fonts. If you have a header font and you have a body font, and they're both Google fonts, you can bring them in with just 1 font. So all you're really doing is changing this and adding to it. So you can say family equals whatever. Crimson plus Pro. They called it. Let me see. There's a capital P. Might be important. That one. Let's see, find out. Is this the fully broken one? So that's no longer, all of the font here is no longer, it's now Crimson Pro, it's no longer Sanchez. That's it. So using this example, you have that file. Any font you want, just go to Google, find it. All you need is the name. What's it called? Okay, then you can bring them down. If it's 2 fonts, you can bring them down by putting the and between them, and then end with a display swap, because that's actually better. Okay? And if you need to reference it, it's right here. Okay? There isn't really much there. There's other stuff in terms of default styles and things like that and so on. But that's exactly what's kind of going on here. So I'm going to go back to Sanchez. I don't need the plus if it's 1 word. And then I'm going to look at the main CSS. It's probably in the main CSS. At the top, there it is. In the body, font family is Sanchez, or Times New Roman, or the default serif font. Remember, that's a ranked list. Sanchez should never fail, but it could fail. Why? Because I'm loading it. When somebody loads the page, it goes to the Google Font servers and downloads that information every time that somebody views the page. If that link is broken, if the server is down for whatever reason, or it's just you can't successfully link to it, then Sanchez won't be there. And it'll go, oops, what am I supposed to do now? Sanchez, your first choice, isn't available. Well, default to Times New Roman. It'll be, like if it defaulted to another Google font, then it would be like, well, that's not working either. So you have to have a list to make sure things fail gracefully. Okay? Times New Roman isn't exactly like it, but it's good enough that it won't kind of break things. It won't like get huge, really big or really small likely. It'll still be readable, and it's not gonna, if it breaks your layout, it's probably not gonna be too serious. So again, remember, it's a fallback kind of position. That's how we do it. But that's how you do fonts. Find your Google font, look at this example, bring it on in, and it's ready to go. Make sure that's changed back. So not hard, right? So that's the font problem solved. Again, you might think, well, I can't find anything in Google. If you come and say to anybody, if you come to Jared's particularly, but if you go to anybody and say, I can't find a font that I really want on Google Fonts, it's kind of like you're using a stupidly weird font name. It's generally going to be the assumption. I want the horror with the teeth coming down, or I want some sort of Gothic font or whatever, like real goth, not like Gothic. There are Gothic fonts on Google. Look through it. Out of those hundreds of fonts that they offer for free, I'm sure you can find one that's going to work for you. And that's all I have to say to you about fonts. Any questions? All right. Take a break. Come back at 5:02, please.